In the late 18th century, a learned and saintly Muslim called Sheikh Ahmad set out on a journey from his home on an island in the Persian Gulf. He was prompted to travel by his conviction that the Promised One mentioned in the Islamic scriptures would shortly appear on earth. Sheikh Ahmad believed that this holy messenger of God, whose coming was prophesied, was a great world teacher expected by all the peoples of the world. His appearance on earth, Sheikh Ahmad believed, would mark the beginning of a new age for humanity, an age when the different religions would become united and all men live in peace.
A young man named Sayyid Kazim heard of Sheikh Ahmad's teachings and traveled across the country to meet him. Sheikh Ahmad greeted the young man joyfully. He knew that he had found someone with whom he could share all his knowledge and the longings of his heart. Together, they studied and prayed, traveled and taught. Sheikh Ahmad appointed Sayyid Kazim as his successor, and after his teacher's death, Sayyid Kazim remained at Karbala and continued to teach there. One of those who came to learn from the Sayyid was a young man called Mullah Hussein. Mullah Hussein was a pure-hearted and eager seeker after truth and a brilliant scholar. Sayyid Kazim knew that he could trust Mullah Hussein completely. He had great confidence in the young man's ability and sent him on a special mission to Iran.
Sayyid Kazim urged his followers to scatter far and wide, to look for the Promised One, to give up their careers, their belongings, even if necessary, their lives in their search. Mullah Hussein returned from Iran to find that his teacher had died. He spent 40 days in prayer and fasting, preparing his heart for the journey of search. Some of his fellow students, inspired by his example, began to do the same. When the 40 days were over, Mullah Hussein set out on his journey with two young companions, his brother and his nephew, who were both barely 20 years old.
The three young men left Karbala with no clear idea of where they should look first. They prayed earnestly for guidance from God, and Mullah Hussein found himself being drawn as if by a magnet towards Shiraz, a city in the south of Iran. Shiraz is a beautiful city, famous for its poets, its flower gardens, and nightingales. Mullah Hussein and his companions arrived at the city late one afternoon. They were dusty, hungry, and tired. Mullah Hussein sent his companions on ahead into the city and lingered for a while outside the city gate, wondering what he would find in Shiraz that might lead him to the Promised One.
As he stood outside the city gate, a young man with a radiant face and wearing a green turban approached him. The young stranger smiled and welcomed Mullah Hussein to Shiraz as if he were a long-lost friend. His radiance and serenity, his purity, courtesy and dignity made a strong impression on the travel-weary Mullah Hussein, who was filled with joy in the stranger's company. The young stranger invited Mullah Hussein to enter the city and refresh himself at his house. Mullah Hussein explained that he had sent his companions on ahead and that they would be waiting for him.
Commit them to the care of God. He will surely protect and watch over them, said the young stranger. And he escorted Mullah Hussein into the city of Shiraz. It was time for the evening prayers observed by all Muslims. The two young men knelt in prayer, and Mullah Hussein prayed fervently that this strange encounter might somehow help him in his search for the Promised One. Mullah Hussein unburdened the deepest longings of his heart. He spoke of the journey and search that he had undertaken. Ali Muhammad listened attentively and then asked whether Sayyid Kazim had given any indications as to how his followers would recognize the Promised One. Mullah Hussein repeated the description given by Sayyid Kazim. He is of a pure lineage, is of illustrious descent, he is endowed with innate knowledge, is free from bodily deficiency.
There was silence in the room for a few moments when Mullah Hussein finished speaking. Then Sayyid Ali Muhammad spoke, quietly but in tones of strength and power. Behold, all these signs are manifest in me. Mullah Hussein was greatly surprised. He began to protest, saying that the Promised One he sought was a man of unsurpassed holiness, and the cause he was to reveal was a cause of tremendous power. But even as he spoke, he experienced a sense of awe and remorse. He ceased to protest.
The declaration that he was indeed the Promised One was made by the young merchant of Shiraz to Mullah Hussein 2 hours and 11 minutes after sunset on 22nd May 1844. It is a date and time that is celebrated by Baha'is as the beginning of a new era in human history. O thou who art the first to believe in me, were the exact words he spoke to Mullah Hussein. Verily I say, I am the Bab, the gate of God.
All through that night, Mullah Hussein sat and listened, oblivious of time and of the companions who awaited him as the Bab continued. While the city slept around them, the Bab warned Mullah Hussein that he must tell no one, not even his companions, of what he had seen or heard. 18 souls must, said the Bab, in the beginning, spontaneously and of their own accord, accept me and recognize the truth of my revelation. Unwarned and uninvited, each of these must seek independently to find me. As the call to morning prayer was raised from the minarets of Shiraz, Mullah Hussein left the house of the Bab. Joy, wonder, excitement and awe filled his soul. The knowledge of his revelation, he said, had galvanized my being. I felt possessed of such courage and power that were the world, all its peoples and potentates, to rise against me, I would alone and undaunted withstand their onslaught. The universe seemed but a handful of dust in my grasp.
40 more days passed before the other disciples of the Bab began to recognize him. Independently of one another, some in fasting and prayer, some in dreams and visions, they recognized the station of the young merchant of Shiraz. The Bab called together those disciples who had reached Shiraz and told them to scatter throughout Iran to spread his teachings and to prepare men's hearts for the coming of him whom God shall make manifest. He stressed the great responsibility that they carried, urged caution and moderation, and warned that they would face torture and death as a reward for their efforts.
I am preparing you, he told them, for the advent of a mighty day. Exert your utmost endeavor, that in the world to come, I who am now instructing you, may, before the mercy seat of God, rejoice in your deeds and glory in your achievements. Scatter throughout the length and breadth of this land, and with steadfast feet and sanctified hearts, prepare the way for his coming. Heed not your weaknesses and frailty. Fix your gaze upon the invincible power of the Lord, your God, the Almighty.
The followers of the Bab set out joyfully to spread his teachings. The message that they gave sparked off a tremendous excitement in Iran. People thronged to hear them, and the fame of the Bab grew swiftly. Rich and poor, simple and learned, town dweller and villager alike wanted to know more. A number of learned and highly respected religious teachers became followers of the Bab. The authorities became alarmed and reacted swiftly.
The Bab was put under house arrest as a wave of passionate inquiry rocked the country. The Shah sent Vahid, a most trusted advisor and a learned, influential, and highly respected man, to investigate the cause of the excitement. Vahid became a devoted follower of the Bab after 3 interviews with him, and at once began to spread his teachings. The Grand Vizier, the chief minister of the Shah, became extremely worried. He was frightened that the Bab might influence the Shah if they should meet. He therefore imprisoned the Bab at Marku, in the north of the country.
The people living around Marku were simple farmers, ignorant of the world beyond their own hills, and hostile to outsiders. The prison governor was at first hostile to the Bab, but soon realized that he was no ordinary person. He began to love and revere the Bab. The local farmers felt the influence of the prisoner in their lives. They came to stand beneath the prison walls in the hope of hearing him chant his prayers.
Again, the Grand Vizier became alarmed and sent the Bab to a more remote prison at Chehriq. The governor of Chehriq prison was the Shah's own brother-in-law. He was harsh and unpredictable, and at the outset acted with great severity, but he too yielded to the fascination of the Bab. Persecution of the Bab's followers increased as the teaching spread in Iran. The Bab was filled with anguish and sorrow at the deaths of his followers. While in the prison at Chehriq, he wrote down a great many of his teachings. He knew that his own death would soon come. In 1850, unable to stop the spread of the movement, the authorities decided to execute the Bab in an attempt to stamp out the heresy once and for all. Thus, after 3 years of relative freedom and 3 of captivity, the Bab's 6-year ministry was hastening to its spectacular climax. The Bab was taken to Tabriz. As he was led into the city, a young man threw himself at the Bab's feet and begged to be allowed to die with him. The young man was arrested and condemned to die with the Bab.
On his last night on earth, the Bab was radiant and joyful. He knew that his mission was accomplished despite all opposition. Early next morning, the Bab was interrupted as he was dictating last-minute instructions to a companion. Soldiers sent from those responsible for the Bab's imprisonment attempted to hurry the Bab away, but he spoke to the official in charge, saying, "Not until I have said to him all those things I wish to say, can any earthly power silence me. Though all the world be armed against me, yet shall they be powerless to deter me from fulfilling to the last word my intention." In a sequence of events remarkably similar to those experienced over 18 centuries earlier, when Jesus received his sentence without fair trial, the Bab was taken to the homes of 3 eminent religious leaders to obtain the necessary death warrants. Not one of them condescended to face the Bab, as the documents were already written, signed and sealed.
The Bab was led through the crowded streets, where about 10,000 people had thronged to Tabriz to watch him die. The leader of the regiment ordered to execute the Bab was a Christian named Sam Khan. He was impressed with the goodness and humility of the Bab and was deeply troubled by the task ahead of him. "I entertain no ill will against you," he told the Bab. "If your cause be the cause of truth, enable me to free myself from the obligation to shed your blood." "Follow your instructions," the Bab replied, "and if your intention be sincere, the Almighty is surely able to relieve you from your perplexity."
The Bab and his young companion were suspended by ropes against the wall of the barrack square, and 750 soldiers of Sam Khan's regiment took aim at them and fired. When the smoke from the fire cleared, a great shout went up from the crowd. The Bab was nowhere to be seen, and the young man who had been tied up with him was standing unharmed. There was a frantic search for the Bab. They found him finishing his instructions, which had earlier been interrupted.
I have finished my conversation, the Bab told those who found him. Now you may proceed to fulfill your intention. Sam Khan ordered his own regiment out of the barracks and refused to have anything more to do with the execution of the Bab. Another regiment was called in. This time, the bodies of the Bab and his companion were shattered to pieces, though their faces were hardly marred. The execution took place at noon on 9th of July 1850. At the same hour, a fierce storm broke over the city. Strong winds blew, and dust darkened the skies for the rest of the day. The bodies of the Bab and his companion were thrown outside the city walls, and 40 soldiers were set on guard so that the followers of the Bab should not rescue them. Despite this guard, the Bab's followers managed to rescue the remains of the bodies and hide them in a place of safety.
The Bab claimed to be the bearer of an independent revelation from God and the herald of a greater messenger than himself. He changed the Islamic laws and ceremonies concerning with prayers, fasting, marriage, divorce, and inheritance. In his writings, his constant theme is the coming of him whom God shall make manifest.
I myself am, the Bab wrote, but the first servant to believe in him and in his signs, and to partake of the sweet savours of his words from the first fruits of the paradise of his knowledge. The Bab believed that God's next messenger would appear very shortly after his own death.